Last year, Congress danced around the idea of a White House appointed national cyber director to coordinate federal cybersecurity strategies and responses more effectively, despite concerns about bureaucracy bloat. But then FireEye found the sunburst malware in SolarWinds software in December, uncovering one of the biggest software supply chain attacks ever, which compromised federal agencies and government contractors alike. Now, some cyber experts say we need a national cyber director more than ever. Today, Trey Hare, the director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative under the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council, is going to discuss why we need a national cyber director. Before coming to the Atlantic Council, Trey was a senior security strategist at Microsoft, where he addressed cloud and supply chain security. He was also a fellow with Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Cybersecurity Project and holds a PhD in political science. So to start us off, Trey, coming out of major incidents like the sunburst SolarWinds hack and the Exchange vulnerabilities, how does the cybersecurity landscape look different than perhaps it did a year ago?
Yeah, no, thank you, Katie, and thanks for the invitation. I'd say two things are really prominent. The first is we recognize a set of dependencies on technology we don't secure well, much more clearly than we did a year ago. People have been talking about supply chain security for more than a decade in the ICT space, really even multiple decades when you start to think about some of the original debates about trust in code and trust in hardware. But really significant policy action to bring robust and reliable security practices to that set of risk have been lacking. And they've really, I'd say at this point, been far outstripped by the threat, as has been demonstrated by these two events. The Sunburst event in particular shows us how much we have to be thinking about risk as a holistic construct. When I buy software from you and I tie it to a cloud service from a third-party vendor, I'm not just thinking about the risk of two products. I need to be thinking about two chains of products going back many iterations into those different vendors, into open source projects, into academic projects in some cases. Excuse me. And so I think the first is really the Sunburst event has shown us or really redemonstrated just how far back those dependency chains go and how aggressive we need to be thinking about risk throughout the landscape. The second piece, though, and it's been highlighted by the Exchange vulnerability, is just how quickly the house of cards can tip over. You know, it can be easy to convince ourselves sometimes that when we're thinking about risk management, we're talking about cybersecurity defense, and we're spending all these money, it's money, and we've got all these programs, that we're in a position of really having a handle on the risk, that we know to a good extent really what it is that we're facing, what threats we're facing. And I think Exchange and the breadth and the scale with which those vulnerabilities were rapidly exploited by a number of different criminal and state-backed groups demonstrates just how fast we can go from thinking we're relatively okay to really being in a serious crisis. And it underlines that need for significant, not only coordinating capacity, but also really expertise at the very highest levels of government.
How do you think the sunburst SolarWinds hack impacts the conversation around establishing a national cyber director?
I think it underlines the need. It's interesting. Congress and the Solarium Commission made a very aggressive push and really an overdue one to put, not just as Senator King has put it, one throat to choke in the White House, but also to really build an office and try to staff that office and resource that office with the capacities to make change within the federal government, but also build expertise with the private sector. In some ways, it's unprecedented. We've been talking about the conversation of a central cybersecurity entity in the United States for a long time. But to have an entity that reports directly to the president, that's 75 seats, that's going to have budget once Congress appropriates it, that has these responsibilities and this authority to oversee budgets and work with both federal and private sector partners, it's really a significant opportunity. And so I think in some ways the event has just redoubled the insistence or the need or the urgency with which the office be stood up and its first director appointed. But importantly, also, it underlines the significance with which the public and private partnership in cybersecurity is going to have to mature, right? As more than simply government regulating the private sector, as more than simply acquiring technology and trying to manage its risk, but really a partnership in designing and deploying that technology in ways that minimize exposure to these sorts of low probability, but incredibly high consequence failures. And a vision from a single office and a single coordinator like that's going to be really important.
In the event that a national cyber director is appointed, what do you think should be the director's top 3 priorities, especially in the wake of the SolarWinds hack?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, keep the house from burning down has to be priority 0, but I think we'll sort of stipulate that that's the case no matter what. Three things. I think at the top of the list has to be building a different relationship with the major hyperscale cloud providers in the United States. When you think about the opportunities that come from cloud adoption, we've been talking about this for years. It enables the kind of graduated IT spend and specific feature acquisition that large organizations want to be able to have access to, and without buying tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of hardware that they're never going to use, know how to support. It enables some interesting opportunities on the security side as well, and being able to not only capture but leverage and do sophisticated analytics on a much wider set of data. The flip side of that, though, is cloud computing means that organizations are embracing a set of technical architectures that they are going to be largely unfamiliar with and that are not all that transparent to them, right? And there's differences between the different deployment models, infrastructure, platform, software as a service. But realistically, the trade-off that's being made here is that users and organizations are sharing responsibility for their own security with a cloud provider. And that the line of where that sharing happens is a really significant one. And I think what we're seeing with Sunburst in particular is that the line between provider and organization is actually a lot more variable. It's a lot fuzzier than we once thought it was, depending both on the kind of product, kind of cloud service, the manner of cloud deployment, but also on the maturity of the organizations in that relationship. And so given the significant consequence of any sort of systematic compromise of the three major hyperscalers, their networks, their technology, their customers, I think there's an opportunity for the NCD and their office to start a relationship, to really restart a relationship that's far less about security regulation and is less about checkbox compliance, and is more about proactive design and architectural governance, so that these services are accumulating as little risk as possible as they're adopted widely across the federal government and much more broadly in the private sector. So priority one, I think, is rebuilding that relationship, or restarting that relationship. The second has to be taking significant steps to empower not just the federal CISO, but the broader cybersecurity governance apparatus of all agency CISOs inside of the federal government. There are requirements being levied on organizations in some cases that are the exact same set of requirements being levied on their neighbors, right? And thinking about the relationship between an entity like SBA and DoD, these are not the same organization. They're not capable of the same things. They shouldn't both be asked to develop from scratch the same kinds of policies. There's an opportunity, I think, coming out of Sunburst and Exchange to see more centralized governance and distributed operation, and to really clarify the roles and relationships of some of these central governance entities. The NCD has a strong role to play in empowering with this access to the private sector and with this new sort of bevy of cyber expertise and its staff, empowering some of those relationships and really clarifying those roles to support federal partners. The third, though, I think, and this is significant, especially when we're talking about the security of this ecosystem, is doing everything in the NCD's power to simplify the existing rules and regulations surrounding IT assurance and governance. One of the challenges that we identify in a report the Atlantic Council released just this week, the sort of lessons coming from Sunburst, is just the overwhelming complexity of the rules that federal IT assurance and cybersecurity leaders have to manage in implementing this hardware and working with the private sector and talking with even partners within the US government. And so as we're talking about ways to improve cybersecurity outcomes and really improve the risk profile of the federal enterprise, both .gov and .mil, simplification has to be a huge part of that conversation. And from our standpoint, the NCD has a significant role to play in identifying areas where there is significant overlap, where there are roadblocks, where there's duplication of effort, in some cases 3 or 4 or 5 programs all trying to accomplish the same thing, and working with other partners across the federal ecosystem to bring some rationalization to that.
That kind of feeds into my next question, which is about whether or not a national cyber director would just create more bureaucracy, or whether or not there's a real opportunity here for a national cyber director to create meaningful change, especially like you were saying, with regard to the overwhelming complexity of the rules and the regulations, and how a director could simplify that. Could you dive into that a little bit?
The Office of the NCD is sort of scoped to do 3 things that are really interesting, that in my mind contribute to it being more of an opportunity for progress and for coherence of effort in future rather than additional bureaucratic overlap. The first is it has the authority to review budgets. And that's a significant driver, as we know, of everybody's behavior across the federal enterprise. And that's an opportunity for the NCD to help not only rationalize behaviors, but also in some cases support them, right? To avoid just issuing a ton of empty mandates. and helping, again, to empower some of its partners across the federal enterprise. I think that's a really significant but undersold piece of this puzzle. The second is the NCD's size, 75 staff, means that there are opportunities to build clusters of expertise, not just within the full-time staff, but to use those staff to build networks inside and outside of the federal government. You could absolutely see the NCD running half a dozen study groups and existing informal private-public working groups to address issues as they come up. One example that jumps out to mind for me is the TIC working group that's been moving in and out of different phases of sort of productivity and focus over the last couple of years. That's a very technically focused set of issues, but one that has significant impact, not just on the regulation of cloud services and the IT risk environment, but also really asks some fundamental architectural questions about how we trust the networks that we're building and operating in. Where there's an opportunity for the NCD to take up issues like that opportunistically and keep pace with them and actually move them forward at great speed in coordination with other partners across the federal enterprise, I think there's an opportunity not just to be making new rules, but in some cases streamlining, simplifying, and getting rid of new rules, and getting rid of existing rules. And so the size of the office is a really significant complement to that. The third, though, is just the position relative to the president. And I think the NCD, because they report to the president, because they're working alongside the National Security Advisor, are going to be able to drive parts of the national agenda in a way that a coordinator role or a leader in another federal agency is not going to have necessarily the same capacity to do. And again, I think a lot of that, very much like the National Security Advisor, is to shape and focus and communicate the priorities of others across the federal government and in the private sector to help the president shape his agenda around cybersecurity rather than coming up with lots of programs and plans of their own. But that positioning is significant, and it's intentional from the Solarium Commission that this be an advisor and a counselor to the chief executive. And so that's something where I think there's prospect for progress, not just forward, but in sort of coherence with these other priorities and with the rest of this broader agenda.
So piggybacking a little bit on something you just said about streamlining the rules, in your new report on sunburst, you recommend the U.S. adopt a cyber strategy of, quote, persistent flow. Can you discuss what that looks like and how a national cyber director could lead this approach? Absolutely.
So the core tenets of persistent flow are speed, balance, and concentrated action. So we walk through these really quickly. This idea comes from the term persistent engagement, which is a way that scholars and the IR community and some folks in the cyber policy community describe interactions in cyberspace. Persistently engaged, the United States is with adversaries, right? It's not in circumstances where there are sort of infrequent interactions. We are constantly contesting this environment and pushing forward and back. And part of what we're trying to articulate with persistent flow is that those relationships are not just contests for space. They're not just contests with an adversary in some sort of faraway domain. That offensive activities take and have significant influence on defensive outcomes. And so as we're thinking about the interaction of these different activities, offense in many cases is moving and cycling and evolving at a rate that is determined by its competition with the adversary. The speed of defensive activities, by contrast, in many cases is determined by budget cycles and acquisitions time frames and risk management platforms and program lengths. And our point in thinking about speed is really first that these two communities need to be talking together much more effectively, but also their speed needs to match. One of the challenges that we saw observed in Sunburst is there's a series of regulatory and cybersecurity mechanisms that exist inside the federal enterprise that are targeting threats and are sort of working at a pace that might have been effective 10 years ago, really are not keeping up, even with the risks that are being assumed from non-malicious code, right? Just the timeline to review and certify certain programs does not keep pace with the rate at which that code is being developed. And so when we think about speed, we're trying to prioritize the way that defenders think and move in a fashion and at a pace that matches the way offensive entities and adversaries move. The second, with respect balance, is going back to that persistent engagement idea, recognizing that what we do abroad, what we do in offense, shapes the defensive environment. And so trying to not only take back information about what adversaries are doing, right, and actually trying to anticipate where they're going, but recognizing that our offensive activity makes defense, in some cases, defensive outcomes better or worse. And that's okay. These exist in some degree of symbiosis. But that balance is significant because as we are moving to effectuate national security outcomes through cyberspace, we have to recognize that there will be an effect on our defensive organizations and their operations. One of the things that we talk about in the report is putting together a working group between industry, certain key industry groups, and certain key public sector organizations, both offensive and defensive, where there's an opportunity to share not just information, but insights about ongoing offensive activities and adversary behaviors. This is a tricky conversation to have. It's a small group that would be possible, but it's the kind of small trusted environments we've seen function well in other cases. The goal being mostly to give defenders awareness of when they should expect a deluge of activity, when they're going to see, their threat board light up in a way that is otherwise unindicated by any other sort of, foresight or warning mechanism that they have. Giving defenders an opportunity, giving them time to anticipate and respond. So I think that is a big piece of the balance concept is the second one. But the third is just coherence of action. When we talk about persistent flow, one of the things that we're trying to complete is this idea that as you're acting in offense and acting in defense, because there is this symbiotic relationship, information is being passed back and forth between these entities. And there's this kind of continual struggle to figure out who has leverage over the adversary in order to effectuate some outcome, right, to gain some strategic advantage. The ways that we see risk talked about in many cases by both public and private sector entities in the United States talks about broad defense, right? I mentioned this term holistic risk at the beginning. I want to go back to that for a second. When we talk about holistic risk in certain cases, it suggests we're trying to defend everything, which as we know is a recipe to defend nothing. So when we talk about holistic risk, what we're really saying is identifying the point source of risk that you're exposed to as an organization and working back to understand its source, not just how it manifests inside of your organization, to try to find the most efficient way to remove it or to mitigate it. So when we talk about coherence of action under persistent flow, what we're saying is efficiency and prioritization matter as much as anything else. We're going to leave some systems behind. We're going to be able to apply the best techniques and the most rigorous methodologies to only a subset of the risk that we know of. We have to accept that, right? We already know and have internalized from FISMA days, right, that there are certain high consequence systems more so than others. But we haven't really internalized that when we talk about broader federal risk management. And in the cybersecurity space, it's constraining us. It's really limiting our ability to take the most harmful systems and defend them as effectively as possible. So when we think about persistent flow, a lot of it is just trying to move at speed and in balance and with as much coherence as what we see with adversaries as a way to keep pace.
So how could a national cyber director potentially cut through the informational silos between DHS, DoD, DOJ, and the intelligence community? And what challenges do you see in this area as all of these different federal agencies are working to provide cyber response?
So I think one of the things that's attractive about the NCD is it's not an operational organization. It's not going to supplant FBI or DHS or DOJ. Its job is both to drive core strategic principles from the president's agenda, to develop that into a significant and cohesive strategy, but then also to implement policies developed by the executive branch and in partnership with the legislative branch and industry. One of the things that's significant in my mind about the relationship between the NCD and these other agencies is that partnership, and is in attempting to, and I think hopefully to be successful in pulling activities that have potential overlap or good relationship with other activities and putting them together, right? Breaking down some of those silos by virtue of the NCD's ability to have visibility across all of these different communities to help shape a more coherent set of responses. I'll give you a good example. It's a private sector one, but I think it speaks exactly to what we're talking about here. There's a company that operates a sort of wide set of infrastructure across the world, has a number of customers. It both develops its own products and has to sell them. And inside of this company, there's a tension between security operations to defend core products and longer-term investigative efforts. It's a very similar process as you see in some cases with DOJ, Secret Service, FBI Secret Service, and DHS. The challenge is that as defenders are trying to burn down threats and burn down risk, they're also eliminating opportunities for the kind of investigation that moves back up that chain, like we were talking about holistically, to find the source of threats, right? They're stamping out ransomware everywhere it starts. They're not necessarily chasing the franchise owner that's renting all that ransomware out to users. And so where we see the opportunity here is for NCD to recognize these different efforts and put them into conversation in places where they're not, and try to streamline and make them coherent where there's opportunities for that sort of complementarity, and then to drive strategy and resourcing around that. So in some ways, I think it really, in sum, the NCD is an opportunity to see where good activities are happening, to put them in concert with others, and to really resource and grow those that are most effective.
So got one more question for you to finish us off here. Why a national cyber director? How could they address inefficiencies in federal cybersecurity that Congress could not?
You know what? It's a relatively small organization inside of the executive branch. It's an opportunity to concentrate expertise, coordinate, and build strategy. All of these are functions that Congress is not set up for, is not well suited for. Congress has a tremendous opportunity to shape the relationship between the NCD and these different agencies through oversight, through its funding power, right? Through not only the way that it addresses these issues, but the way that Congress shapes the authorities of these different agencies. So there's absolutely has to be a conversation between these two entities as the NCD stands up. But I don't think it's duplicating roles that Congress would otherwise have. And in many ways, you listen to the statements from Senator King and Representative Langevin and others, the creation of the NCD really does appear to be, the will of Congress to try and provide a better partner in the executive branch on cybersecurity. So in some ways, I think it's going to be a sight to see.
Great. Well, we are out of time, Trey, but thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. And for anyone who's interested in hearing more about the sunburst malware and how all of that happened, you can go to atlanticcouncil.org/breakingtrust to read the report.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.